All right, I was finishing up with chapter 4, part B, and this is from the book White Fragility, and it just gets a little harder every time as we talk about these different aspects of things. So let me just quickly run through a couple of comments that she makes. And she's talking about a feeling of innocence on our part, on the white culture, that we didn't have anything to do with this. We certainly didn't propagate slavery. We certainly are not part of the problem of white supremacy in its worst possible forms and manifestations. And we struggle to understand our place in this. And this particular chapter would like us to think about our innocence, our presumed innocence, or what this does for us to keep us from being responsible for and to do something really. Not necessarily trying to lay blame anywhere, but to get us to be more active in trying to undo, and reverse some of the cultural standards that we've come accustomed to living in. She says, I've heard white people claim because they grew up in segregation that they were sheltered from race. I think that was my case. I was in a segregated school until 7th grade. And then in 8th grade, we were segregated by, I think, federal law. At the same time, people of color, they grow up under this understanding that they are the minority race or a minority race. And so they grow up with race right in their face, right in the front of everything they do. And we kind of get an innocence. We proclaim an innocence from that kind of racial understanding because of our white culture. But she challenges us here to say, hey, white segregation is not racially innocent. So we need to unpack this a little bit. And as I said last week, this happens in the North, in the South, in the East, in the West, all over the place, because white people are everywhere. And therefore, these problems exist everywhere. The idea that racism is not a white problem enables us to sit back and let the people of color take the real risk of invalidation and retaliation. And they're the ones marching. I had someone just recently say, why are all the black people in Seattle, Washington, or Portland, Oregon? And I had to counter that understanding by saying, well, they're not all black. In fact, most of them aren't. They're just very activist in their understanding of white fragility, and they're taking an active stance to move against that. Now, I'm not advocating violence. We know that we have issues where people make violence out of these things, and many times that's manipulated to destroy the very movement that's trying to be brought forth in that situation. But basically what that means for us, claiming white innocence, is that we're not required to take cross-racial risk. I don't have to go over there and do this or act this way or involve myself in this because I'm innocent of it. We position ourselves as standing outside these hierarchical social relationships. And that's really not true. We are at the top of it, and we sometimes don't want to even admit that. White flight is one of these aspects of white racial innocence. It's justified by beliefs that people of color, especially black people, are more prone to crime. If too many black people move into a neighborhood, and it's a matter of racial, it's a matter of ratios. It's okay to have a certain amount. I think the great white fear that we came to understand over the 90s and into the 2020s is that we are becoming more and more a brown nation. And suddenly, I know for me as a white person, I thought, what is that going to mean for me? What is that going to look like for me? If too many people of color become dominant in my culture, what's going to happen to me? White families consistently discussed the fear of crime and associated crime with people of color. And I've discussed this before as we talked about white flight. The vast history of extensive and brutal explicit violence, though, is more often perpetrated by whites and their ideological rationalizations. We have been the people who have been really responsible for the worst outbreaks of violence that go on, not just white upon white, but definitely white upon black. And I invite you again to look at what happened out west. What was the town that I can't think of the town now, in Oklahoma? Was it in
Tulsa?
In Tulsa, yeah. There was that community right outside of it, and the National Guard and white supremacists got together and they firebombed and went in with armed forces and completely wiped out a very prosperous black community that were trying to make their way in the world. And that violence was perpetrated by whites upon blacks. The criminal behavior of white juveniles is often blamed on external factors. Their parents got a divorce, he's got extenuating circumstances, they've had a rough time at school. But black and Latin youth are not afforded the same compassion. This is the accusation that's being declared at us when it comes to the legal system, when it comes to the court system. More often it's attributed to something internal to someone who is of color. So half of the sample of medical students and residents, they did a survey, a study on this kind of thing, and discovered that they feel like black people feel less pain. We had a recent story where a black woman was telling the doctor that something was wrong. She was pregnant, she was having difficulty, and she almost died because she could not convince the white doctor that her concerns, her problems, her pain was real. And they are declaring to us that that's something that comes with our white innocence, that we think these things and it's underlying into who we are and how we behave. Our race, the white race, gives us advantages. And we get defensive about that, we deny that, and we resist the accusation that we are advantaged. And those things run deep, and that's where white fragility really comes from. We describe privilege as if it's a fluke. It's just something that happens to us. And I gotta admit, I've gone through most of my life with this white privilege and being totally, quote, innocent of it, or totally out of my mind because it was not something I was raised to understand. I never thought about race because everyone was my race. So suggesting a person could walk through life with other people stuffing money into his or her pockets without any awareness or consent on the walker's part is kind of like me claiming white innocence. It's not really what we're trying to do here. It doesn't make anything better. We have benefited from the dominance of the white race in the culture that we live in today. It's secured, our advantages has been secured by others and by the past as a process of domination. Actively and passively, consciously and unconsciously, this dominance is maintained. It's maintained in the economic systems, it's maintained in the health systems, it's maintained in the educational system. People of color could teach white people about, oh, there's an expectation that people of color should teach us white people about racism. It's another aspect of white innocence, of racial innocence that the white culture declares. And it reinforces problematic racial assumptions. First of all, racism is not the problem of the people of color. It's all of our problem. It's a human problem that we all have to be willing to work at, to face, and it's not something they have to overcome or that they have to sit us down and make us aware of. We deny that racism is a relationship in which both groups are involved? No. Both groups are involved, and we're involved with it, so we've got to get active in it and not be... Innocence is more this passive-aggressive type thing. We're not doing anything, but we certainly don't want to be accused of being this. So we remain silent on questions about our own culpability with systematic racism. So we ask people of color to do the work for us, to teach us about it. Why haven't we sought it out before this conversation? Why haven't people who are in the loan giving business, in the education business, a lot of times these things become aware to us and become issues for us, and we've swept it under the rug. People of color have indeed tried to tell us that what racism is like for them and how they've often been dismissed. But we've got to be willing to build trusting relationships, be willing to meet them halfway, be willing to live in their neighborhoods and engage with them. I heard on Trevor Noah's show, one of his correspondents was talking to an individual who teaches this kind of white sensitivity, and he said, well, tell me, who are your black friends? And she named all the correspondents on the Daily Show. And he said, wait a minute, you work with them. Is that the only time you engage with people of color? And she admitted, yeah, that's the only time she ever came in contact, was when she was in an educational setting or a work-related setting. These people did not come to her house. These people did not play with her children. They did not celebrate birthdays and anniversaries and holidays together. And for heaven's sakes, if they went to church, they certainly didn't go to church together. And that leads us into this understanding of segregated lives. James Baldwin was famous for making the quote, "We have a Christian church that is white and a Christian church which is black." And it says, I know that the most segregated hour in America is high noon on Sunday. And that's the truth that we're having to deal with. It's true. And it's still true today. It's not in their unions. I'm not in their unions. I'm not in their how does this put this? The real estate lobbyist. James Baldwin says, keeps me in the ghetto. I'm not invited to be a member of their union. The textbooks they give my children to read in the schools that we have to go to are substandard or out of date or don't have the truth printed in them. They've got a whitewashed history. If you went to Tulsa, Oklahoma and looked through the history records, the whole experience of what happened there has been wiped off the books, has been changed. History was written by the people who won the struggle, and the others are socialism, which you assure me exists in America. James Baldwin says, I don't see it. It never comes to me or my people or my culture. This is not the America that you live in. It's a different one. So whites are most likely to choose segregation. We grew up in segregation. Schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, shopping districts, especially places of worship, even places of entertainment and social gatherings can be. I kept thinking that was going to change, and we've made some inroads, but it's more a tokenism. We show that 10% or 5% are of people of color, and we feel like that we are diverse. And that's not the truth. There's a lack of racial diversity, and we're seldom encouraged to build cross-racial friendships. And it's kind of hard when we live in one place and they live in another. So she goes on to talk about urban whites, people who are from the lower classes who are more integrated at the micro level where they live. But trust me, they are taught and presented to them that they want to move out of there and get into the suburbs, into the segregated. If they could move up in the world, they would be moving away from their cross-cultural, their diverse communities. So white environments, in turn, is seen as the most desirable. If I'm going to improve my life, I cannot stay in these neighborhoods. I must move me and my children to better neighborhoods and get better schools, and I can get better health care. Segregation was still operating, she says, in my life at the societal level. It dictated what I learned in school, read in books, what I saw on TV, and learned to value if I wanted to improve my life. So it's everywhere in the United States, neighborhoods and schools. They're not equal. Separate and unequal. The tax bases, school resources, curriculum, textbooks, opportunities for extracurricular activities. These things are still a problem across racial lines. We allow other people's children to endure conditions that we would find unacceptable if our children were enduring them. So the coded language she understands, when we studied how white parents chose schools in New York City, they called it a post-racial era. And all they were thinking about were the grades. We've got to have good grades, schools that are going to get good results. It was racially coded, urban, low test scores. They were all code for not white and therefore less desirable. How painful an experience it was to be one of only a few people of color in those schools and neighborhoods. Yes, we were good at the tokenism, but that wasn't really what we were, what is best for American society. We've got to become more diverse. All right, I'm going to have to cut this short because we're live and it's storming. So imagine how unsafe white schools, which are so precious to white parents, might appear to parents of color when they have to send their students there. The most profound message of racial segregation may be that the absence of people of color is no real loss to our lives. And what the final point that she's making in all of this is, we should consider the fact that if we live in a non-diverse, if I go to a primarily white church, if I live in a primarily white neighborhood, I have decreased my effectiveness and the quality of my life in engaging the total of humanity. So she says that it's important that we realize that we are doing our entire human race a disservice by not seeking and actively working for diversity in our schools, in our neighborhoods, and in our churches. So she says again, the patterns of white fragility, a preference for segregation, and a lack of a sense of loss that we are so segregated, that really hurts us. A lack of understanding of what racism really is. Seeing ourselves as individuals that were exempt from the forces of socialization. A failure to understand that we bring our group's history with us and history matters. Assuming everyone is having our experience. A lack of humility about our white dominance and unwillingness to listen. Dismissing what we don't understand. A lack of authentic interest in the perspectives of people of color. Wanting to jump over the hard personal work and just get right to the solutions. Confusing disagreement but not understanding. Understanding is what we're trying to get to, not just that we agree to disagree. No, we're trying to get to understanding. The need to maintain white solidarity, to save face, to look good. That's what tokenism leads us to. Guilt that paralyzes or allows inaction, and defensiveness about any suggestion that we are connected to racism. So telling me to treat everyone the same is not enough to override this socialization that we've all grown up in, nor is it humanly possible. Most of us would not choose to be socialized into racism and white supremacy, but unfortunately we haven't had that choice. We need to actively work now to live in a more diverse culture of race. God bless you. Go in peace. Let me get out of here before lightning takes us. All right. I'll see you soon. God bless.